80s music. I was surprised. There's a lot of words I can use to describe 80s music. Cold. Some people say it's fun. Some people say it's danceable. Synthesizer heavy music. A lot of one-hit wonders. But today I was surprised. I was going through a list of 80s songs and just reading down the list, and I was absolutely surprised by what just leapt out at me. It was just how violent 80s music actually is. I mean, look at some of these titles. Dangerous by Roxette. She's so dangerous, right? Eye of the Tiger by Survivor. Even the band name kind of speaks to this. Fight for Your Right, Beastie Boys. Hit Me With Your Best Shot by Pat Benatar. Really, just anything by Pat Benatar. What about Heartbreaker? Hurt So Good by John Cougar Mellencamp. Even the video for Jack and Diane, that's not necessarily a violent song, but how many times does he wind up and just, punch at the camera? Countless times, really, many times. Kiss Me Deadly by Lita Ford. Wanted, Dead or Alive by Bon Jovi. Now, that's another band where just about anything in their catalog probably qualifies. And Shot Through the Heart, anybody? Tainted Love, Soft Cell. Take On Me by A-ha. That's maybe a more hidden one, but when you think of taking on somebody, well, you can take on a challenge, but it's another phrase that connotes sparring or fighting. Come on, take me on. I'm ready for you. Can you take on me? So what do I get from this? Well, love is a fight, right? Get what you can from them before they get what they can from you. Keep your fists up. A lot of songs about running away, chasing people who've run away, not wanting to be forgotten. I mean, it's the 80s. It's brutal. It's brutal. I don't care how fun the songs may sound on the outside. I really can't escape the violence of this music. And I never really thought of it in quite this way before, but maybe that's always what kept me distant from that music. So what is this about? Well, I can only speculate. Is it all the action movies that were popular at the time? Is this just what was cool? I mean, this was a time of Urban Cowboy and the A-Team, and Tales of the Gold Monkey was one of my favorites, and everyone was fist fighting somebody. I don't know. I personally think it's Reaganomics. You might laugh, but hear me out on that. People thought they were happy, and people were told that they were happy. But I think on some level of our being, we knew that the social contract had been broken. It was every woman, man, and child for themselves. You get what you can before they get what they can from you, and it's a competition. And you can't count on anyone but yourself, and you're hurt. You kind of need people, but you want to run away from, you really don't want them. It's brutal, and I think it's reflected in the economics and the politics of the time. It was candy-coated and made to seem like it was fun and happy, but my gosh, the rage here. Even in the 80s, I didn't really like 80s music that much. Now, these were my elementary and middle school years. I probably entered kindergarten or first grade at the turn of the decade and entered high school at the beginning of the 90s. So that was kind of that era for me. I'd say around 6th to 7th or 8th grade. I liked whatever was popular on the radio. I grew up on my parents' albums from the 60s and 70s. Some country from the 80s. But as I was exploring more on my own, I was always exploring on my own, even when I was going through their old albums. But as I was really just going out and listening to what was on the radio, I liked basically what was on the radio, pop music, top 40, some hair bands, of course. A little bit of rap, but I wasn't as familiar with it back then, and I never really got into metal. But I really got into the people that I call the gateway musicians. These were people who were popular at the time, but once I learned them and got to know them and got to know their back catalog, they opened me up to the 70s. And then I really never looked back. I mean, these was Phil Collins and Genesis, Billy Joel, Elton John, and most especially Bruce Springsteen. They were popular enough on the radio so that someone listening to Top 40 could get a chance to listen to them. But then once you liked their songs, bought their albums, saw the depth, heard that, you can't go back anymore to pop, what was called pop music at the time, which was just didn't really have the same depth as the album rock of the 70s. Um, I'm not going to say one era of music is better than another. That's hard to do. I do prefer the 70s and definitely other eras in the 80s. I've heard people say 70s music was sad, and maybe it is. But to me, it's honest. It's honest music. People wanted to connect to one another, and they grieved when those connections failed or when they didn't know how to bridge the gap. In the 80s, it seemed like it was more about denial. They were denying that they even wanted that. But they kind of did, but they kind of didn't. They played happy, but the anger, the coldness, the rage is apparent, especially looking at it from a distance. Now, I didn't necessarily know this at the time, but really when you listen, see this list of songs, and you just see, right, their love is a fight. And keep your fists up, and that's how you go through life. That's how you go through love. That's how you go through relationships. So very clear looking back now that that's what the 80s was telling us. And it was telling us other things too. I mean, nothing is all one thing, but um, very, very kind of alarming, to be honest, and very tragic. I certainly don't dislike all the musicians of the 80s. Some of these folks, like Lita Ford, I think she's great. There's something about her that I think she's way more talented than I think anybody has ever really fully recognized. She's a gem. I like John Mellencamp, and I really respect what he's done to reclaim his name. Um, and I think he always seemed like a musician that had a lot more integrity than some of the early antics he was doing. A lot of these bands, I mean, I don't dislike Bon Jovi, and a lot of these one hit wonders are good looking back, but it does make me really think about what was going on in the 80s, and then also, why do people like it today? I've never really quite understood that. I'd be curious to know other people's thoughts on where they think these themes from the 80s were coming from. Certainly maybe it was just all the Rocky movies, and the boxing match was somehow a symbol of life and relationships. I don't really know. Maybe the despair of the 80s and the coldness was really because of the unfulfilled promises of the 70s, and you got to hold them responsible. I don't know. As someone who's not really a huge fan of 80s music at all, really, um, maybe I'm the wrong one to ask, because all this does is give me more reason to not like the 80s music. But just some interesting observations I had, and I just wanted to share them. Thanks.